Good evening, everybody. Hope you're all having a great week. Got some nice weather here in Clarendon, New York, so I'm sure it's the same throughout Rochester. Actually, I know it is. I was at work today, and I had to go out in the back dock. And when I got out there, it's our store is actually built into a hill, so um, sometimes I have to remember that in my department, I'm actually under the ground. But when you go out to the back dock, it's sheltered, so you don't get that wind that you get in the parking lot. And the sun was coming down, and I just thought, you know what, I just have to stand out here for a minute and let the warmth soak into me. It was actually quite nice. But tonight I have something really simple. I don't know if I should apologize. So we've had some people out from work due to sickness, and it's been crazy. And then along with St. Patrick's Day and people getting their money from the government, it's just stepped up. People are buying food, which is great. I love it when they buy food, especially produce. But sometimes it makes for long days. And so I have something tonight, like I said, simple. I don't know how long it will take, but we'll see. And but it's really interesting. I found it interesting. It's about perspective, really, and we're going to call it learning love. And it's going to be about a particular man that we find in the scriptures, and learning love. So this man, I don't want to say his name too early, but he was an apostle. He was one of the 12, so he was with Jesus for a bit. And when you wonder, to me, sometimes I wonder about the apostles. And, I know some were fishermen. When I watched The Deadliest Catch, or Lisa and I have become great fans of shows from the UK and Scotland, crime shows. The one in Scotland, there's fishermen. And the one we just watched took place in Ireland. There's always fishermen involved, or fishermen in the families, or something. And you see these fishermen, and they're not big burly guys, but they're, if they have their mind set to something, or you say something wrong to them, they don't seem the kind of people to be quiet and shy away. And so you kind of wonder about these men, all of them actually. What was their state when they became apostles, when Jesus chose them and said, "Come follow me"? Their state of mind as far as spirituality and religion, and the system that they grew up in. What was it? One of them was a Gentile, Luke. What was his state? He was a doctor, so he had some knowledge, and was probably well read for the time. But we talked a lot about the posture, orientation towards God. Did he choose them that because they're open and free of they're open source, ready to take in information, ready to follow? So it's interesting. A lot of times there's not a ton of information about those kinds of things. And even on, most of the apostles, there's not always information about them, period, especially after Jesus is gone. What all of them did, because there's all kinds of extra biblical writings and things like that. That some of them you can, take or leave, because we really didn't really have just a lot of information on them. So, but they all had a starting point, and that starting point had to be when Jesus chose them, when he said, "Come and follow me." That had to be their point. So let's break for a word of prayer here, and then we'll get right into it. Dear Lord, we thank you that we're able to meet together as we do each week. Actually, a couple times a week or a few times a week for those doing the book club. It's great that we have this technology that we can reach out to each other. Lord, I pray that we use it wisely, use our time together wisely. I pray that the things that we talk about, people would look at for themselves, and may it spark some type of interest in delving into things more, like it does with me. And I hope that is the case with all of us, with all believers in general. And I know that comes from you, that spark that your spirit works in us, which we're thankful for. So again, we're thankful for tonight and all these things. We pray in Jesus' name, amen. So all these guys had a starting point. For each one, it might have been a little different. I don't think that any of them were learned biblical scholars with lots of initials behind their names. They probably, as Hebrew men, they probably took part in at least some of, if not all of, the festivities that they were required to do. But even if they didn't, I mean, you think of people that say, well, I'm such and such religion, but I only go to church a couple times a year. Even if someone were at that point, at least they had some type of background, because you think when they grew up, they were taught things. They had some type of education, whether it was formal or casual. They had something in their minds. They knew who they were. I think they probably knew what Israel used to be. And I think they had at least that much. I'm just surmising. So they had to know, at least they had to have some something in their minds already to who they thought their God was compared to others. And so, we can't, like I said, we can't know. But Jesus says things throughout the Gospels that we can see that are, they kind of point to, they didn't know, or they had a preconceived knowledge that wasn't what it actually was. And so Jesus has to correct them. Or when he tells a parable and they don't understand it, they come to him and he tells them afterwards. And then he talks about things that were in the scriptures, in the prophets, and they didn't have a real good understanding of it. And so I don't want to say that they're, I don't mean anything bad by they're ignorant of a lot of these things, but they were ignorant of a lot of things because they just didn't know things found in the scriptures. So it's not hard for me to see, I don't think, that most of these guys were almost starting from scratch. I think that's what Jesus, when he called them, that's what he wanted. He wanted to make a baseline, and then we're going to build up from here. And along the way, I might have to re-show them things, or retell them things, or tell them something new, or remind them of something they might have learned when they were little children. But all these things were things that he was going to build upon in the ministry with them, things that they were soaking in because they had a purpose. And so we can look at Peter as an example. Peter lived with Jesus, and he saw everything Jesus did. When I say lived with, not in the same house, but lived in general life, from the time he was called an apostle, or called to be a disciple, just come follow me. And then over time, he probably came to realize, hey, I'm part of the inner circle here. I'm going everywhere with this guy, and I want to see everything. I mean, he saw miracles, healings. He heard incredible things that Jesus taught. He had, by the time the cross comes around, he had a really good knowledge of what Jesus was teaching. And of course, we know that him included, didn't want Jesus to die, and they didn't really understand exactly why he was going to do what he was doing, why he had to go through it. But in Matthew 26:31-35, Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." And Peter said to him, "Though all become deserters because of you, I will never desert you." And Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter said, "Even though I must die with you, I will not deny you." And so said all of the disciples. Sometimes we read about Peter, and he seems to be a common one to go to for his denial. A lot is made of that. And it's interesting. It says, and so said all of the disciples. So all of the disciples agreed with Peter that they would never deny him, that they would accompany him anywhere, and they wouldn't be deserters. And of course, we know all of them were. So even Peter, when he does this at the end of Mark 14, just as Jesus foretold, Peter denies him. But Peter would go on to become an apostle that Jesus meant him to be. I mean, he was active in ministry. He spent some time with Paul. Paul and him had some go-between and back and forth. I mean, he almost kind of like sometimes I read about Peter and Paul, and I think almost of Peter as kind of a liaison between Paul and those in Jerusalem. But Peter, went on his own too, but he saw amazing things and heard amazing things from Jesus, and some things started to click in his head. And so he went out and did what he was supposed to do. And of course, we know that we have books of our Bibles today, or modern day Bibles. We have books that have letters from Peter, one which we just looked at a little bit recently. So he was doing things. We also talk about Thomas, because Thomas was the doubter, right? Thomas didn't believe. Thomas had to be one of those where it said, so said all of the disciples. That included Thomas. I will never forsake you. I will never desert you, and I will never deny you. Yet when Jesus is standing in front of him, Thomas was all but denying him. And he had to be able to touch the risen Jesus in order that he would believe. And of course, Jesus didn't necessarily take anything away from that, from Thomas. He did say other people will be blessed because they didn't see and they believed. But after that, I mean, what happened to Thomas? There is a pseudographia of Thomas. I've never read a lot of the ones from the New Testament. A Gospel of Thomas. So, some of those things probably are written by people way, way after Thomas. But, sometimes you wonder what did these guys do afterwards? So one that we're going to talk about tonight is John, who was famously called John the Beloved, because in his book, he calls himself the one that Jesus loved. And of course, he doesn't use his name, and I've read some authors that say the fact that he didn't use his name showed some humility, even though he even brought it out. But he didn't say his name in there. But John came from raw beginnings. He was a fisherman by trade in a family of fishermen. Like I said, I could try to imagine sometimes what did these guys look like. I mean, I've seen pictures online where they try to do, use the computer to generate what people's faces might have looked like. And I've actually seen some of Peter, and he was not a track, or of John or I'm sorry, of Peter, and he was not an attractive man. So I'm not really sure exactly what these guys looked like as fishermen, but knowing the things that I know about fishermen, you could say, well, those are pretty limited because all you know is what you see on TV. That is true, other than some things I've read. However, I think sometimes they're pretty accurate, and many times fishermen are thought of as those guys that are raw. They're out on the sea. They were on the Sea of Galilee there. And they had rough waters. They had a rough time. It was a rough job, bringing fish, hauling them up. Back then they didn't have winches and all the other things they have on the ships now. It was a very physical job. So I'm imagining that these guys were pretty solid physically, and probably looked really rough around the edges. But he left everything behind to follow Jesus. He saw the same things that Peter saw, for the most part. And he heard the same things as Thomas. And Luke 5 says that John, his brother, and Peter were partners in the fishing business. So they all knew each other. What partner means, if they belong to the same fishing firm, we might call it, or fishing group, or did they just help each other out? But they were partners in business to an extent. So John and James, and then Peter. So, it's interesting. You kind of wonder what the dynamic was like between the three of them when they were traveling as disciples. Sometimes I wish there were things like that more things like that in the scriptures that we can read. It'd be interesting to read about more about these guys. But John, though not as described, like I said, would be a little rough around the edges, but he also might have been a fiery individual. And what I mean by fiery is he might have been temperamental. Had a good temper. He might have been a person that had a lot of zeal. And he's not called a zealot because maybe he didn't have it out for Rome, but I think he had a lot of zeal. He might have been, if John had been in Paul's place, he might have been like Paul. He might have been someone that went around and did the things that Paul did. And it's interesting. And you say, well, how do you get that about John? Well, there's a few things about John through the Gospels that we can read. I'm just going to do a couple of them. I believe a couple of them, maybe just one now that I'm thinking about it. But in Luke 9:51-56, so Jesus is on his way up to Jerusalem. He's going to go through Samaria to get there. And you remember Samaria. We find Samaria also in the Old Testament. It encompassed some of the area, or most of the area, of the northern tribes. And we know that those from Judah and from those places, they had differences. I mean, they had a civil war multiple times, and they had a lot of differences. Those in Judah didn't see them as true Hebrews, though that's what they were, but they didn't see them as true because they had their own place where they did sacrifices, and it wasn't in Jerusalem. And so they both had kind of a chip on the shoulder against each other. And Jesus is passing through there on his way to Jerusalem. And it says he sent messengers in verse 52 ahead of him. On their way, they entered a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. But they did not receive him because his face was set toward Jerusalem. When his disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" But he turned and rebuked them. Then they went on to another village. So they're going through this village, and you have to imagine the messengers that went ahead probably said, "This is Jesus," and I'm sure they knew who Jesus was. And he's coming through, and he's on his way to Jerusalem, and they probably said, "No, we don't want him here because we know what he's going to do, and we don't we don't take part in that, and we just don't want them to stay here. And so for whatever reason, and James and John, brothers, the sons of thunder, they're called, decide that these people, this village, including all that live in it, need to be destroyed, consumed by the fire of God, or fire from heaven. In the Net Bible and some commentaries, they note that there, in some manuscripts, there's an addition to that verse. And in fact, the King James Version has that in it, and many of the more modern English translations do not have it in it. But in Luke 9:55, and I'll read this from the Passion Translation because they included it in there, it says, Jesus rebuked them sharply, saying, "Don't you realize what comes from your hearts when you say that? For the Son of Man did not come to destroy life, but to bring life to the earth." And other ones just say that something along those lines, and he came to bring life, not death. So the sons of thunder, they were ready to go. Somebody refused Jesus. This whole village refused you. They need to be taught a lesson. And what does Jesus say? How can you think that? What have you learned from me that would put it in your heart to want to do something like that? And because Jesus he's saying, I'm not here to do any of that. I'm here to offer life. I mean, think about eventually John writes a gospel. And, in that, the way he talks and the things that he teaches about Jesus show exactly what Jesus was trying to say here in verse 55. That's not what I'm about. That's not why I'm here. If they don't want me, we'll go to the next, and we'll find someone who wants to take us in. And I'm guessing that they did. So where might they have heard this before? And you go back to the Old Testament in 2 Kings, and the prophet Elijah is one who did such a thing. So he's told by God to tell the king of Samaria that he was going to die in his bed because he and his people, who he leads, have been going after a false god, or going to seek information from a god who is called Baal Zebub, and that's two words. I know we often say Beelzebub or Beelzebub, but it's Baal, who is the high god. And remember, we talked about the celestial beings. Baal, there's Baal, and then there's many hyphens around him that attach other names. So this was one of them, and he is of Ekron. So the folks in Ekron worship this Baal. And Ekron, if you remember from earlier in the Old Testament, Ekron was part of the Philistines. And so this is, long before this, but these are people that worship other gods. And so the king of Samaria is going through them. And so God is passing a judgment on him. So this is the same Samaria that Jesus is passing through to get to Jerusalem. So just can I give you an idea of the mindset? This is the northern area compared to the southern area, the ones that the northern one, or the southern ones who think they do everything right, and the northern ones who think they do things the best they can. And there's enmity, there's issues between them. So I don't know if John knew about Elijah, but the same type of thought enters his head, call down fire from heaven. He didn't say Jesus called down fire from heaven. He said, do you want us to call down fire from heaven? So, or should we call fire down from heaven? Maybe he means all of us together. But Elijah does something similar. So, the king hears the prophecy through messengers from Elijah, and he wants to talk to Elijah in person. And of course, Elijah doesn't do so. The king sends a military group down of 50 men, plus whoever their leader is, or it might be him and 49 men. But anyways, 50 men. They go down and they say, "You have to come with us." And he says, "I'm not going with you." And so, they call him a man of God. In some translations, it just says a prophet, because man of God, that's what a prophet was in those days, a man of God. A man of God didn't mean that they were necessarily a man who did everything that God wanted or was in good standing with God. It meant that they were a prophet, which is interesting if you look at that. So he's a man of God. He says, "Well, if I'm a man of God, then let fire come down and destroy you." And that's what happened. Fire came down and destroyed them. After Elijah, so a second crew comes down to do the same thing, a little more forceful at Elijah, and they're consumed because they go through the same thing, and he calls down fire. The first time it just says fire from heaven. The second time it says fire of God, but fire coming from heaven. It's interesting in these two verses. Nowhere do you read that God said to call fire down from heaven, or that God sent the fire down from heaven. It just says Elijah called down fire from heaven and burned them up. So a third troop comes down, and the captain or the leader asks Elijah, "Please take value of my life, of our lives. Value us as people, as humans, and understand that we're living beings, and we're just coming here because someone asked something for us to do something. We just want you to come with us." And so before Elijah is able to consume them with fire again, the angel of the Lord steps in and says, "Don't be afraid, just go." And so that, to me, that's a key thing in that verse, in that story. That's a key verse. I didn't put the verses down here, but they're in 2 Kings chapter 1. You can read through it. But the idea that the reason that he consumed these men with fire from heaven was because he was afraid. He did not trust in God to keep him safe. And so he used, as one author I read, a semi-autonomous power, or this guy believes that God gave power to these men, just like he did to the disciples. "I am giving you a power. I'm giving you the power to go out and heal, the power to go out and exorcise demons." Just kind of like Moses' staff. Moses' staff had power in it. It was a representation. And Moses could use that to show who God was. But the idea was that sometimes it's possible that they might have misused their power, like Moses striking the rock in anger. I take that now as that staff represented God himself, and he struck a rock out of anger instead of doing as God would tell him to do. So I think there's something here to be discovered in this story, but it's kind of like John and James. They have this thing in their minds where this is not the way things are supposed to go. So what's the recourse? Kind of like we've been learning, what's the recourse? What do men think? Display mighty power, burn them down, and nobody else will do the same thing. So the angel of the Lord steps in to make sure Elijah doesn't do such a thing again. And Jesus steps in with these two brothers the same way. No, that's not what we're doing, because that's not what I'm about. And it's not actually what you're about either. So the next thing that we see John with is they ask, in one gospel, it might say the mother asked. And I think when it says the mother asked, it might have been the three of them together, or she might have been speaking for them, or they were speaking together, but she initiated. And then in Luke, it just says that the brothers asked. But we know there's some differences like that between. So I chose to use Luke, or I'm sorry, Mark, because I want to see that James and John, according to Mark, are not absolved of anything from this story. It wasn't just the mother. So they go and they ask Jesus in Mark chapter 10 if they can get a position on either side of Jesus, one to the right, one to the left. And of course, we know that Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. And then it's not for me to grant. These positions have already been determined, or God only can set this, and I can't. But all the other disciples eventually learn, whether they hear them asking. If they were there when they asked, they must have been beside themselves, but they still were afterwards. They were incensed and angry. And I think it's at the boldness that they could ask such a request. And I don't even think it's that, well, maybe we want to be on the right or left. That might have been part of it. But I think part of it was, well, who do you think you are that you're going to, because if you're on the right hand, you're a ruler. Who are you that you're going to rule over us? Why do you two think that you stand above us, that you could be, ruling with Jesus, and that we would be beneath you, or not on equal plane? And so, I think they're angry. And you almost think of Joseph. He has the dream, and in one of his dreams, he's going to lord over his brothers. And of course, his brothers were angry about it. I mean, his father I think his father kind of made it light to try to diffuse the situation, or he didn't understand what Joseph was saying. But the brothers became very angry. And of course, we know there's already jealousy there, because they thought that he was their father, held him to a higher regard than them. And, we know how that story went, but just the same type of thing that these other apostles must have felt is, who do you guys think you are? And Jesus diffuses the situation. And he does a really good job, which we would expect because he's Jesus. But in Mark chapter 10, verses 41 to 45, it says, when the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, talking about all of them, all of you, you know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be the first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. I mean, in part of that passage, I think, well, didn't they hear this on the Sermon on the Mount, right? Didn't they hear this any other time? Of course, they're humans, and they have feelings and emotions. But Jesus, it's interesting about the Gentiles, and I think he's probably referring largely to Rome, even the Greeks before them. The ruler that is currently ruling over us, the Gentile ruler, is a tyrant. And they're not rulers for service. They're rulers. They're like dictators. This is how it is, and if it doesn't go this way, I'm going to send my centurions in a legion. They're going to come down and take care of you. On Sunday, I was looking at a map in the back of my Bible, and it had to do with my dad's sermon, but I just wanted to get a look at the lay of the land. And in my Bible, there's something I never noticed before. There's little purple shields ringed around the area, and each purple shield has a Roman numeral and a Roman name next to it. And when I looked in the key, it is all of the legions that were sent to quell the uprisings by the Jews. And if you just think that was just mostly in Jerusalem, you would be mistaken. It was all over, even in Macedonia. So as we've been learned for many years, these guys were up to something. But these were the same. This is the fiery attitude, the nature that these guys have. And of course, they're upset with each other. So it's interesting how Jesus kind of turned that and said, none of you want to be rulers, because if you want to be great, then you have to be each other's servants. And if you want to be in a position of prominence, you need to be a slave to other people. You need to put yourself to the back and care for your brothers. You need to care for each other. He's talking to the 12 here together. There shouldn't be infighting among you. There's going to be a time coming where, as he prays in John, I think chapter 15, I think he prays to God, and he's praying about their future welfare and safety, and that they need to be friends. They need to work together. They need to be each other's servants. Those are the things that are going to mean something to them, not who sits on my right or my left, because it's not going to be either any of you. But that's not what it's about. It's about you going out and being subservient to those who you're giving the message to, those who you're spreading the gospel to, you're spreading the kingdom to, getting them to open their eyes to this and seeing what's going on. You need to be like a servant. You think of Paul and all his writings where he says things like that, right? And my dad was just talking about Thessalonians the past few weeks, and Paul says that in there, how they didn't come to be dependent on them or to intrude on them. We worked to support ourselves while we were serving you. And so that's what Jesus is trying to get across to these fellows here. And it's interesting that while Jesus was alive, it wasn't in their minds. They still didn't understand what the purpose of it all was. So, he said the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. You think about Philippians chapter 2, and that's what that's about, right? Let this mind be in you. And then everything that Jesus did, giving up of himself, becoming just like a human being, and experiencing all that as a form of servitude. He's here ministering in his life to people, which means that he actually took the ultimate price, which he just said there in verse 45 of Mark 10, to give his life for many. So what mind is Jesus wanting them to have? It's a mind of love, a love so great that he paid the ultimate price on the cross and offer us all life, just like he told them when they wanted to burn the town down. I'm not here to take life. I'm here to offer life, to give life, life as it's meant to be lived. That's what I'm trying to show you. This is what you strive for in life. So, we often think of, so when we, in the book of John, the word love, loved, loves appears numerous times. But oddly, we usually think of Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And I have a couple of those verses, just 4 and 5, but it says, love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. That's what happened when James and John, we're speaking of John, but we put his brother in there with him because I think they were probably pretty close. They were showing irritability, that they weren't able to stay in the village. They were resentful against the Samaritans, just as the Samaritans were against them. These are not attributes that Jesus wanted them to have. And so, it says that he rebuked them, probably sternly. I'm sure it was stern, to tell them that this is not what it's about. You need to get rid of these kinds of thoughts because it's not what it's about. But something happened to John along the way. So I think even during Jesus' ministry, there's a couple other things too I didn't bring up, but if you read the Gospels, you can figure them out. But John, a couple other things about John that show that he was very zealous for Jesus, and he, like I said, was a fiery individual, probably temperamental, and had a tendency to maybe fly off the handle. And Jesus slowly is trying to bring that out of him. And Jesus was successful. Whether Jesus was successful up to the time of the cross, I think John was starting to get the picture. But we know Jesus was successful because John mentioned, the same John that we see in the Gospel of John wrote 1 John. And 1 John is truly a book of love. That's what it talks about. In John 15:12-13, Jesus says, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. And of course, the disciples still didn't necessarily understand. I mean, after all, in the Garden of Gethsemane, a Roman soldier had his ear cut off. So they still weren't completely understanding what Jesus meant when Jesus talked about love, the commandment of love. But John does eventually come to understand. In fact, in the general epistles, Peter, James, Jude, and John, love is mentioned 71 times, and mostly by John. In fact, in chapters 2 through 4 of 1 John, love is mentioned 52 times. 52 times out of 71 in total. The second person behind John is Peter. But John got what Jesus said, and he devoted that entire letter to what love is about. And in fact, we often say he becomes very pointed about it, and has some very things that might bruise people's egos when it gets down to it, of what their standing might be before God when it comes to love. And I think that comes from John's personality. Look, this is it. It's all or nothing. It's the same way he was when he was a disciple for Jesus, as we could see at least a few different times. That same zeal he puts behind that letter into, this is how important love is, and not just love, but love that Jesus described. And I just have a couple. First John 3:11 says, "For this message, this is the message you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another." Yeah, it's amazing to hear John say that, because that's what Jesus was trying to tell him, right? And John didn't always get it, but now he knows. Hey, from the beginning, this is exactly what Jesus was saying, and not only just from Jesus, but from the very beginning, all the way back. This is what we were supposed to be doing, and all of the wrongs of the world, all of the wrongs between people have occurred because we are not loving one another. Uh, and down in verse 16, he says, "We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another." Down in verse 23, it says, "And this is his commandment, that we should believe in the name of his son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, just as he commanded us." John says it's not a request. We have been commanded to love one another. And then finally, in chapter 4, verses 7 to 11, it says, "Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. God's love was revealed among us in this way. God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the atoning sacrifice for our sins. Beloved, since God loved us so much, we also ought to love one another." And so I think the biggest thing that John took away uh, from his time with Jesus um, was love. Uh, he I think that was the main thing that it came down to. I know that we have Revelation, and there's a lot of stuff in there, prophetical things and things that were about to happen. But I think the main thing in his life became, we have to love. And the more we love our neighbors, the more we love people around us, the better our lives are going to be, and the more oriented towards God, or postured towards God, we will be. And that love includes servitude, as Jesus said. And I'm, I like to imagine now that John, in his old age, or whatever age he might be, is, that's what he does. He's got the community that's around him, the people that he ministers to, and that is what his life became. And that's how he writes. So that's how I think we can see how John learned to love. And I think it's almost similar to what we saw in Paul, except for Paul had the ability to act out his zeal, where John did not, because he stayed with Jesus and followed him. But he still had that mindset, and it had to be brought down. It's never all at once. It takes time. It's, for some, it takes a lot of time. So that's what I got tonight.